literature. That's it. Okay. And she's an associate dean of graduate studies as well. So we have students that get in mediocre singing her way. In any case, we invited Mary because she's someone, there are of course others here today, but she's somebody who does something outside of the dominant discourse, which is around teaching English pronunciation. And so, given the theme of the conference, we thought it would be great to have someone, and I think it's something that's unique about her, that she's been working for a long time with principles such as accent, comprehensibility, intelligibility, and applying that to German and to other, as I said, foreign language, and other contexts where we don't necessarily see that, and it's good to see that because it tells us something new.
Thanks, Grantham. So I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers, Ron Thompson, Tracy Derling, and Andrew Lee for their work on the conference and their conference. They hosted in 2016. So it's a real pleasure to be here today. I'd like to thank all of you also for being here today. I'm so happy to finally be together. This is something that I've been looking forward to for so long. So in putting together this talk that I gave a title to 2 years ago, I realized that a different title might be more appropriate. So this original title points towards lingua franca communication. And while the language of the classroom is indeed a lingua franca, my focus is really on those situations in which this larger community of speakers doesn't exist outside of the classroom. And so it's not so much about having native listeners around, but not having any sort of community around. And so as such, my revised title is this, pronunciation training in the absence of any sort of target language community outside of the classroom. So here I'm really talking about the US tradition, foreign, or as we call them in Canada, heritage languages. So those that aren't spoken within the broader community. So my paper is going to proceed as follows. I'll begin with just a brief background, talking about, of course, research and full pronunciation training, and teaching and learning of languages other than English. I'll share with you a survey that I carried out in monolingual Western Canada. You'll see why. And then I'll talk about teaching pronunciation in the bigger picture. So, of course, when we're talking about research and full pronunciation training, we know that research has demonstrated that pronunciation training is indeed effective for improving and improving specifically competency. This recent volume, edited by John Levis, Tracy Derling, and Stephen Higgle really points to a number of the central tenets of cutting edge pronunciation. And I'm going to go through those really briefly. And I have to say, I read this book on the and it's really good. So if you haven't had a chance to read it online, okay, so as I said, research and pronunciation training tells us, of course, that comprehensibility can improve. But we also know that it's really important to integrate pronunciation within our classes, within our language classes generally. So while some of us have the opportunity to teach a pronunciation course, kind of on its own, it's really important that our learners think about the fact that pronunciation is everywhere. So, we can't just limit that, so in this class, we're going to learn about grammar and sentence structure. And in that class, we're not totally worried about pronunciation later. Perception training, of course, is really important. Rob has been telling us for a number of years. We need to focus, of course, on segmentals and super segmentals. Technology offers a number of affordances that, that our classrooms don't necessarily afford. Feedback, of course, is essential. We need to have various forms of assessment, considering the goals of our learners in both classes. And of course, there are differences in topics. Okay, so that's the starting point of where I'm going today, but I'm not really going to talk. Okay, this is just kind of where we begin. So a lot of the work, as Ron said, being done, with a number of notable exceptions that I'm going to be talking about in just a moment, is carried about in a setting where the target language of the classroom is either the language spoken by the broader community outside of the classroom. So if we're considering immigrants, for example, refugees, international students, or study abroad settings, or we're talking about English. And we know that English is a language that is highly valued internationally and can be used as a lingua franca around the world. But I live in Canada, and I don't work on English. So although we don't have comprehensive data like this, I just wanted to show you just an image from the Modern Language Association. And we don't have something like this in Canada, but here you see a map of the US. It's from the Modern Language Association's most recent report on language learning in the US. It was published in 2019, and it provides data about enrollment in language courses in courses other than English in the US. This includes 2,639 post-secondary institutions. So, you know, we're not alone. Those of us who don't teach English, it's really important to remember that. But, you know, I find myself, like many of these language instructors, not having this broader community. And that's really what's lacking for many of us. It's important when we think about language learning that, you know, as teachers, we come into the classroom and we have kind of these preconceived notions about why our learners are there. And they're maybe idealized. So it's important to remember, though, that our students come to us for a variety of reasons. So for many of us who are, or many, I guess this is my case, you know, the learners in our classrooms are immigrants or refugees. So these are individuals who come to our classrooms highly motivated to learn a new language because they're in a new place. Learning this new language is linked to job opportunities and ultimately the ability to not only survive, but to thrive in this new setting. For many of us teaching within schools of all sorts, our students have to take languages. So maybe there's an entrance or an exit requirement where we are. This is often the case in US institutions, but I have to tell you at my institution, it's not. So why are my language majors in the first place? I often ask myself that question. Well, I mean, we need to think about the motivation literature, I think, to consider why other learners might actually end up in language classes. So here we can talk about various types of motivation. Gardner distinguishes between these various types of motivation, and we can talk about Jeremy's L2 motivational self-system. And basically, we're distinguishing among the ways that learners project themselves when we're talking about this second motivational self-system. So they're thinking about how they might use that language and how they might be with that language in the future. So some of our learners might take a language out of personal interest, or according to Gardner's terms, integrated motivation. They want to travel, they want to connect with members of the community, they want to read texts in the original languages, and better understand how language works. So this can be considered the ideal second language self in German system, right? They can really imagine themselves. But secondly, there are some language learners whose motivations are really external. They might be imposed by a group, such as a family member, and this is related to Jeremy's ought to self. I mean, people have job opportunities where they have to learn the language. And finally, learners can be motivated or demotivated by their actual language learning experience, either in their courses, with instructors, or with other students. So it's really important to consider kind of this broad range of reasons why learners might end up in our classes. There's been a bit of research on motivation and pronunciation, of course, and it's interesting because it seems like this ideal second language self might have a lot to do with at least positive attitudes toward pronunciation, right? If I see myself speaking this language in the future, then I want to pronounce it well. And this ideal L2 self is also related to greater effort, which might coincide with less accented speech. But ultimately, it seems that the research tells us that even high motivation doesn't necessarily mean better pronunciation, both in terms of less accented pronunciation or more comprehensible pronunciation. And so, and people have tried looking at motivation in a variety of ways related to pronunciation, and you can't necessarily say, hey, be motivated, and you're going to sound better, or be more comprehensible in your second language. It takes a lot more than that. Okay. So as I said, the main issue that I'm going to address today has to do with these other settings. And the big question is, why even focus on pronunciation when we have students who have no broader community of speakers? existential question for me because I've been doing this for 19 years now and wonder often. Okay, so in my abstract, I noted that the majority of pronunciation studies are carried out in English. That said, of course, there have been, especially in recent years, a number of pronunciation studies carried out on the acquisition of languages other than English. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, so I'm sure that I've not included many of you. This is just some example of the great work that's being done. So, as I said, I've been working on languages other than English for some time. Although I work primarily in German, I'm going to start by talking about a study that I carried out a number of years ago that provided me with some really interesting insights into pronunciation. And so since we're in Canada, I thought I would share with you an example that you might have heard about from the Canadian setting. And it's interesting because these learners don't necessarily, even though it's French in Canada, French immersion in Canada, these learners don't necessarily have a community of speakers with whom they can interact, especially. And what happens within French immersion is that children start in kindergarten, in theory, only speaking French in class, and then as they continue through grade 12, in theory, they have less and less French, whereas, by the time they get to grade 12, it's about 50% French. So in Alberta, this is the promise of French immersion. I've just taken this from our newly revised curricular website. We can talk about that later. Anyway, so they're really promising a lot, right? So students are going to be able to communicate in French, they're going to be able to read, write, listen, speak, mute, represent and use strategies, and they're going to communicate clearly and fluently after 12 years. Well, in theory, you would think after 12 years, sure thing. Anyway, I'm going to give you an example of a product of French immersion. So on Thursday, Murray played this video of Lester B. Pearson, who I found out was not French. Here's another example of a pretty famous Anglophone Canadian speaking French, and this individual is indeed a product of French immersion. Oh, no, wait. You recognize him? Just
j'aime beaucoup tous les correct. Très belle, right? Très belle. Vous êtes très belle.
Okay. In his defense, and in the defense of French immersion, I'm not sure that he finished French. Anyway, there we go. So just to provide French experience. So we know within the French immersion system, we see this wide range of outcomes among our students. So it's been highly criticized, saying that students who come out of French immersion, they speak a variety of French that's called French. We do see in actually research studies that have been carried out that there might be less pronunciation accuracy as students progress through the system. So, there might be kind of this notion that, at first you want to sound like a teacher, and that's pretty cool, right? And over time, that's not the last thing you want to do. So, and we see decreasing motivation over time with French immersion programs. So, I have 2 kids in French immersion. But anyway, I'm just going to share with you an example of a child in this study, though, a relatively young child. And I just want you to listen to this child's French pronunciation and otherwise as compared to that of our
Les petits pois. Grand-maman, Nicolas et Michael, ils sont des petits pois. Michael et Kyliers. Ça tourne. Il y a des petits pois dans tous les coins.
Here, not perfect, but I was a little guy, and that pronunciation was, Okay, so I did carry out this study, and I was looking at French immersion in Calgary, and I just really wanted to know more about what was going on with French immersion. It was an accident to this study. I would change a lot of informed me about was that these kids really don't know why they're in the school, right? Like, why am I doing French immersion? Well, you know what? The most popular answer was, I didn't know. And then the second most popular answer was because my parents made me go to French immersion, right? So if we think about that ideal L2 self and motivation, you know, if these kids had no idea, and this was across levels, I went all the way through grade 8 with these kids, and that was the overwhelming response. Then I asked them what their pronunciation target was. I said, who do you want to sound like when you speak French? Do you want to sound like a native speaker from Quebec, a teacher, a friend, somebody else? The most popular answer was, I don't know. And then I asked them to explain, and really there I heard most often, I speak as I speak. So in this paper, we argued that there have to be opportunities for these students to think about themselves speaking French later in life and outside of the classroom. And that's that. Okay. So in classes without a community of speakers, the big question is, to whom do they need to be comprehensible, right? So if these kids, you know, they don't know why they're there, I guess that they just need to understand each other, and if they're all kind of going on this trajectory of speaking Franglish, then where it goes, right? But I think that we can take a lot of advice from Murray and Tracy. You know, we know that our world is changing, and that there are a lot of interactions that are taking place just between non-native speakers. And so this intelligibility principle still needs to guide them. So if we look at research where comprehensibility ratings are carried out by second language learners, we can see that a lot of the findings are similar to those of native speakers. So we see generally that like native speakers, second language learners tend to provide more favorable ratings for comprehensibility and accentism. That's really good. That's what we expect. And Dustin found recently that there are similar ratings, you know, that the ratings really are in alignment between native and non-native speakers. In a recent study that we carried out, we found that there might be some affective factors that predict comprehensibility. It was a rating study, but it was in interaction. And so we found that, you know, when people were less anxious, when they felt that their partner was more collaborative, then they found their partner to be more comprehensible. Okay, so what's the big deal then? Well, in a study in 2014, I had second language learners of German who might be, you know, it's a very different setting from the English as a second language setting. These second language learners of German who were doing comprehensibility ratings in my study understood about 45% of what they were rating. So then that made me think, okay. All right, so if we think then about second language learners, learners of languages other than English, you know, they don't really have this access to a local or a global community of speakers. Easy access, right? We know that we can get them access, but if they're just going to go outside, they don't have that. The motivations, of course, differ, both at the onset of learning, you know, so students who come to our looked classes, languages other than English, they might be really excited, really motivated to learn for all of these reasons that I mentioned before. But what keeps them in our classes, right? The motivation probably changes over time, and we tend to see decreasing motivation over time. There might be low levels of understanding among these learners, and then, of course, we're questioning why the pronunciation, but there's kind of a little bit of an existential crisis here. So I carried out a survey in monolingual Western Canada. Perhaps those of you who don't know much about Canada, don't really think about the province of Alberta, but within Canada, Alberta is kind of considered a little bit woodsy, perhaps, quite monolingual when you think about Calgary. So I have Alberta circled here, and I have a arrow pointing to about where Alberta is. So we're really close to the Rockies. Only English speakers. So in the most recent census, Calgary had about 1.4 million people, and about 940,000 of them speak English as their native language. So this is in addition to about 20,000 people who speak French as their first language. So this leaves us with about 400,000 people who speak another language in Calgary. So although people think about Alberta as this monolingual province, its residents really do speak a wide range of languages. So I carried out a survey, and the goal was really to determine the pronunciation targets of these second language learners who lack this community of second language speakers. So students. To tell you a little bit about the participants, a total of 246 language learners studying at the University of Calgary between 2020 and 2022 carried out the survey. The nice thing about the conference being delayed by a couple of years is that I got a lot of data. So every semester, I just sent out the survey again, and I got more participants to participate. So of these, I had to get rid of a number of people because they didn't complete the survey or whatever. But in the end, I ended up with 223 learners, primarily female, a range of majors. Only 39 of them were language majors. Language is not the third major at the University of Calgary, but we had a really large number of business students, and you can see a number of other students here. A range of first languages, not so surprising, perhaps now that you know a little bit more about Calgary. You can see all of these languages here. Doesn't matter really so much. I'll be happy to show the slides after. If you can't read them, but what I'm going to circle here is that most of them were native speakers of English. Some of them were bilingual speakers, and so when I present English data later, it'll be about 140 participants, but 157 of them listed English or English and something else. And they were learning a range of languages. We have Chinese, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Russian, and Spanish. Other languages that we're going to talk. Okay, so I asked those who are just native speakers of English, because it really, well, I'll tell you why I'm quoted, but what about their language use? So I focused here on their use of English. And these are all native speakers of English who grew up monolingually. I asked them how much English they use. They use it about 91% of the time. Okay. And they might primarily use it with native speakers of English. 8 of these 140 learners have studied abroad. 49 have been there for about a week, anywhere between a couple of days and a few weeks, maybe up to a month, but that's about it. And this was the statistic that, just the finding that really got to me. 37 of these 140 learners never plan to study, travel, or work abroad in a place where this language is being spoken. So then it really caused me to take a step back and say, oh my gosh, what are we doing? What are they doing? So to kind of rethink what's going on. Okay, then I wanted to look at those multilingual learners, people who came to the classes with a different native language, already having learned English and then learning a new target language. They're using English less, not surprisingly, about 74% of the time, close to 91% of the time. 16, so twice as many, with half as many participants, have studied abroad. 29 have traveled abroad, but even among these, 17 of them never plan to study, travel, or work abroad in a place where the target language is spoken. So they may never interact with native speakers. Then I asked participants, this is just the native speakers of English here, how much they understand what's going on in class. Because I thought, maybe that other study that I carried out before, it was in a lab setting, maybe it was just an anomaly. And that was about 45% understanding. So what we see here is that the learners understand about 60% of what fellow learners are saying, and about 65% of what's going on in classroom tasks. If we add the multilingual learners to this, we can see that they understand even less of what's going on. All right, so once again, a little bit of a crisis for me, like, what's going on here? And we really kind of need to rethink what's going on in terms of how we're teaching. So I have to tell you that at the University of Calgary, early languages, the first 2 years of languages, and I imagine this is the case probably probably across many institutions, the curriculum is based on the book. And that's how things go. And if you looked at any textbooks, language textbooks recently, you'll know that pronunciation, if it's there, is really just kind of a sideline, right? And so many of our teachers are fantastic scholars of literature. And so focusing on anything that's not in the book is really difficult to kind of conceive. So if pronunciation isn't there, it's not going to be taught. So this is where I think we all come in. And I think that a lot of what I'm going to say, especially for those of you who are already speaking or who are already teaching within a lingua franca context, they're going to say, of course this is the case. But I just want everyone to realize that this is very much not the case of what's going on in our non-English language classes. So I asked participants in this study what their second language use goals and pronunciation targets were. The good news is, this is for all of the learners, all 223 learners. Participants were asked what their goal, which goal was the most important for them. We can see that the biggest chunk of the pie here is speaking to be understood. That's good news for us. And secondly, listening with ease. Right? So we can see that is, I would say that's really good news. I asked participants an open-ended question about what pronunciation training should look like. And here we can see that the largest proportion of learners favor listen and repeat. And this is followed by articulatory phonetic training. Comments were like things like, I want to learn how to move my mouth. I want to know the position of my mouth and tongue, or how to move my lips, for example. So the next most frequent response, though, after this was that top response, they're not sure. So then I wanted to know, well, how much pronunciation training have they had? I told you a little bit about the book. Well, most of our students have never had any sort of pronunciation training, so anything they have in mind probably comes, who knows where it's coming from, right? But it's certainly not, they haven't been pronunciation training. Okay, I asked them about their goals for pronunciation training, comprehensibility. If we add both of the darker colors together, they want to be understood, which is fantastic. But most of them want to be understood by native speakers. That's the largest chunk. The second largest chunk, however, is not having accent, right? So they want accent-free speech, and they want to sound like a native speaker, and they've never received pronunciation training. Right? So this is what's going on, right? So there are not only, it's not about mixed messages within our language classes. I think it's about no messages within our language classes, right? Pronunciation just is a non-entity. Okay, so if you remember from that French immersion study that I told you about, one of the biggest predictors of having better, less accented pronunciation was having some sort of target. Who do I want to sound like when I speak French? Well, in this study, for most of the participants, they didn't know a French speaker beyond their instructor, or whatever, the target language speaker beyond their instructor. And so many of them just said, well, the only person I know who speaks the language well, that's my teacher. Right? Some of these, we have a large number of native speakers, but also a relatively large number of non-native speakers who are teaching our languages. So yeah, and then the next most popular response is that students aren't sure. I don't know. Like they can't think of somebody who speaks the target language. So really quickly, a summary of findings. We find that our participants are not using the target language very much. They don't really understand a lot of what's going on in class. They don't have pronunciation training, and their language learning goals, however, I think the positive in all of this is that they want to speak to be understood, and they want to listen to you. So I think, I could stand back and say, oh, this is really bad news, or I could turn it around and say, this is a fantastic opportunity. How can we move ahead? And that's where I'm going to take it. And I think that we, as teachers of languages other than English, we can take a lot from those of you who are teaching English as a second language. We can learn a lot from you. Now what? Okay, of course, as was the case last time, These are, kind of fundamental principles as we move ahead. But I think when it comes to learners of languages other than English, we need to think a lot more broadly about pronunciation training and consider the impact that training can have on learners more broadly, regardless of whether or not their current or future plans involve interacting in the target language outside of the classroom. So within a broader view of communication and comprehensible communication, I think we need to take into account students' various motivations and plans for learning their language and using them. So in the time that remains, I'm going to focus on three main principles that I think I will use regarding pronunciation, and these have implications that extend far beyond pronunciation of the target language. So the first is that pronunciation matters. Lots of our learners don't know this. Second, comprehensibility goes two ways. It's about understanding and being understood, and our learners need the tools for both. And perhaps most importantly, I was teaching a speaking and listening class during the first fall COVID term. And as I was thinking about the course, I was like, speaking, listening, how am I going to do this online, right? And so I thought differently about what pronunciation means and what communication means, right? And I shifted my thinking to think that we need to have opportunities for engagement and really for extended discourse for our language learners. And maybe I know that many of you who are teaching within a lingua franca context, you think, of course, extended discourse. Yeah, let me tell you, that's not how things work within our language classes, right? It's going back and forth with the teacher and the student. Okay, so pronunciation matters. That's my first point. This was the title of my very first paper that I published in a journal, Unterrichtspraxis, which is for German teachers. It's from 2004. And of course, I've changed a lot since then, thank goodness. This was 18 years ago. I do stand by this title. Pronunciation really does matter. So, but moving ahead, of course, I agree. Levis and Eckelberger in this recent volume point to the need to incorporate pronunciation in a planned and meaningful way into all of our lessons. So what does this look like? So our focus, of course, needs to be on training that has the greatest impact on comprehensibility. If we take a broader view of pronunciation, of course, we need to think about phonological awareness, of course, within the target language, but beyond the features of just the target language. And then using socially constructed meta-language so that students can talk about language. So I'll address the first one first. So explicit awareness of pronunciation matters, but not for pronunciation in the target language, but it also matters beyond, right? The ability to talk about pronunciation, I'm going to give you an example in just a minute. It really matters, right? Talking to people about various sorts of things, making yourself understood within, when you're dealing with non-native speakers of your own native language. All of these things certainly matter. Translanguaging is the one way within, especially our multilingual classrooms, where we can use all of the language resources that we have to make comparisons across languages and to use those as resources to enable broader thinking about pronunciation more generally and communication, of course, too. We know that phonological awareness can have an impact on a variety of areas, including vocabulary learning, autonomy and motivation, reading abilities, and grammar, just to name a few. If we talk about then socially constructed meta-language, perhaps we have the opportunity, Cooper also wrote a paper in 2011. So he demonstrated that explicit pronunciation instruction and the ability to talk about pronunciation features in the classroom enabled clear and concise feedback and potentially improved pronunciation. So in addition to this, although research has demonstrated that learners tend to demonstrate difficulty in assessing their own pronunciation, there have been a number of studies where we ask listeners to assess their pronunciation and they can't do it. Some recent studies have demonstrated that actually training learners to assess and to self-assess can be highly effective. So Tsunemoto and colleagues demonstrated that learners can better assess their own pronunciation through benchmarking tasks that involve working with exemplars that demonstrate a range of performance levels. So learners can develop and discuss assessment standards that they can then use to assess their own pronunciation. And those of you who attended the talk yesterday or who read any of these papers, Martin and Sippel have demonstrated improved pronunciation performance along with kind of this greater the sense of how pronunciation works among those learners who gave feedback, as opposed to those who necessarily received it from a teacher or other students, right? So, you know, this whole notion about giving feedback on language, and of course, this can extend far beyond just the target language. So I'm going to give you an example from my own life very recently. This is conversation, which we just had here very recently. I'm anyway, my job, Ron mentioned that I'm associate dean, so not in this picture, but in convocation, many of our convocations this year, it was my job to read names of students as they come to the stage. They gave me a little card, and I was the lucky person who got to say, for the degree, doctor of philosophy in whatever, this person. And without that awareness, this phonological awareness, I mean, not that I won every time, certainly I got some wrong, but I was able to speak with all of these learners or all of these graduates before convocation to listen, right? To see what their names were, to understand how that pronunciation would sound, to write it, and then to actually announce them perhaps much better. I don't know, I hope much better, right? But then in the real world, we know that names matter. Right? So just talking to our students about things like that, right? When you learn, when you get to know somebody in a, you know, whose native language is not one that you recognize right away, just ask them how to pronounce it. Right? Very simple things, right? But without kind of this notion of phonological awareness, it's difficult, I think, for people to think about those sorts of things. Okay. Secondly, comprehensibility is about understanding and being understood. Of course, that's and a number of studies have demonstrated that comprehensibility involves a lot more than pronunciation features. So we need the tools to understand, and we also need tools beyond pronunciation to make ourselves understood. So in terms of the tools to understand, of course, you know, our students need to focus on segmental contrast in terms of top-down listening techniques and also bottom-up listening techniques. But they really need the tools that go beyond really close listening, right? They need to know how to listen to understand in broader context. So they need, for example, the vocabulary, not just words and their meanings, but also hearing the words and knowing what they sound like, knowing how they're used in context. And so they also need to have key expressions to let their interlocutors know when they don't understand, right? These simple tools, right? These simple strategies to negotiate for meaning really matter. And I know that a lot of you are already doing this, but I know that a lot of us currently are not doing this sort of work, right? So and we can imagine how giving our students these tools will allow them to be more confident and, you know, really ultimately succeed in communication. And they, of course, also need tools beyond pronunciation. They need vocabulary, right? So a number of studies that are looking at comprehensibility focus, and this was an early one, Isaacson Trifinovich pointed out that comprehensibility, you know, there were pronunciation features, but they pointed to the fact that vocabulary really matters, right? Diverse vocabulary, precise vocabulary. Having key expressions really matters. Right? Being able to use those key expressions to let interlocutors know this matters, what I'm going to say right now, or you need to follow along. Knowledge of speech acts really matter. How do I, in the target language, get X or Y done? Organization, signposting, use of reference really matter, especially in longer discourse, so that our listeners can follow along with what it is that we're trying to say. All right, so here's just an example of, you know, understanding and being understood in the real world, regardless of, you know, the kind of customer service setting, perhaps a call perhaps just any sort of customer service setting where we're dealing, it doesn't even have to be a non-native speaking interlocutor. We need to know how to negotiate for money, right? And I think that this is a perfect example of, even native speaker interactions that often go off the rails because people aren't actually speaking to communicate. They're speaking to, achieve a goal that is perhaps not a common goal, right? So negotiation for meaning is really involved, and it's an awareness of how the dialogue unfolds, how to interrupt effectively. All of these sorts of things can play a role in getting things done. Okay, and then finally, practice should allow for opportunities for engagement and extended discourse. So Henderson et al. Pointed out in 2015 that much of the published corpus research about pronunciation instruction shows that restricted tasks, including teacher and learner analysis and feedback, take up the majority of instructional time, right? So there are often not these opportunities for engagement and extended discourse. So the 2 points that I would like to raise is that our students our learners need the opportunity to speak, and they need to consider audiences beyond their teachers. Okay. So first of all, many of our communicative classrooms, especially those at the lower proficiency levels, really do involve this back and forth. Maybe a word, maybe a sentence at a time between the teacher and the student, or between two students. Think of group work and partner work. Often what happens is that students have to work their way through 12 questions, filling in a blank, and so they take turns using just the word that fills in the blank, right? So we can extend this. Of course we can extend this. So basically, and then what happens at the end of all of this? I can say we try to send our learners out to CEFR exams, for example, where they have to give a presentation for 2 minutes. Fantastic, this doesn't seem so difficult, but if they've never been given the opportunity to do so, how can we expect them to do so? And it's even the case within, our oral language exams. We say, okay, now all you've done in class is to work with a partner doing a sentence at a time, but you're going to come into my office, and for 2 minutes, you're going to give me a presentation on this topic. My gosh, no wonder why our students are anxiety ridden when it comes to oral exams, right? Okay. So with the right tools and the proper encouragement, they can have the confidence to become more willing to communicate. So, they need to understand that discourse is co-created, right? It's this back and forth negotiation. And we also know from a range of research that relevant topics are a heck of a lot more motivating to talk about, and learners are able to do so. Right, so we should consider that sort of, when we're giving our students presentations, if really what we're interested in is having them show their best self, why not have them talk about what they're interested in, as opposed to, something that really motivates. Okay, and then we need to consider audiences beyond the instructor. So we know that comprehensibility evolves through interaction and feedback. And oftentimes students are just recording perhaps speech samples for their instructor to get feedback. And I'll refer again to Ina's recent research where that's not necessarily the most effective way to make it work. So the participants in Trifanovich et al. 2021 were dyads of non-native speakers. And those who showed more encouragement and nodding, just as the listeners, right, were perceived as easier to understand, right? So it's that's a simple thing. How am I a good listener when I am listening to what people say? Right? But you need to have somebody beyond the instructor to make that happen. And then finally, making connections outside of the classroom. These are really important. So if there are local heritage communities, why not take advantage of that? But also we know that there are many opportunities for video conferencing with speakers in the target language community. So instructors can encourage, for example, asynchronous communication, which involves completing tasks that pair up students with one another or with native speakers of the target language. And so there are a lot of opportunities that just exist out there. There are services like My Language Exchange or Talk Abroad that allow us to connect with language learners, connect our language learners with native speakers for language practice. So we know that in the real world, if we're teaching our learners generally what it means to go back and forth, to engage in extended discourse, this can of course extend to things like geometry, for example, right? So it's not just about the target language classroom and the target language. Okay. So I know that I didn't have to convince you about why pronunciation learning matters, but I hope that each of you can take away the fact that a potential shift really needs to happen in the way we focus on comprehensibility, and that this can benefit all of our students, regardless of whether they plan to live in the target language community or not. Never use the target language outside of our classroom. So providing students with pronunciation instruction can extend them far beyond just pronunciation. So first of all, we know that focusing on pronunciation can enhance practice, or can enhance confidence, motivation, and communicate generally. We know, of course, that pronunciation instruction should start early and integrated into instruction, and that this can bolster a number of aspects of language learning, and indeed language use more generally. And finally, and perhaps this is my most important takeaway, pronunciation is just one aspect of communication. Students need to learn to have the tools, the strategies to communicate. Thanks.
Okay, well, we have about probably 5 minutes before the coffee break, and so if people would like to ask questions or make comments, you're free to do that. But thank you so much, Mary. That's really helpful and very practical.